So I'm proposing that we do the election first so that we can have a chair and vice chair, and then I'll happily turn this over. So in order to do that, I need a motion from the floor to appoint me as acting chair for the purposes of the election. Dina. Can I have a seconder? Helen? All those in favor? Excellent. Okay, so I'd like to declare both the positions of chair and vice chair for this committee vacant. The elections will be held in accordance with our bylaw. I am going to ask for nominations. I'll ask for nominations 3 times. And each nominee or for the positions will have to accept the nomination. So starting with the election of the chair, can I ask for nominations for the position of chair of the Policy and Planning Committee? Okay, so I have somebody who's willing to. Okay, so okay. Any other nominations for the position of chair? Any other nominations for the position of chair? Okay, can I have a motion to close the nominations for the position of chair? Jean Careau and Helen. Okay, all those in favor? Carried. Okay, there being no other contender, I acclaim you in the position of chair and will invite you to the head of the room here to assume the position and to hold the election of the vice chair. Thank you so much, Bev.
This is the first. So do I need to ask for nominations for the vice chair?
Yes, ask for nomination. Asking.
Okay. So is there any nominations for the vice chair? Yeah, is there a seconder to that motion? Second by, John. All in favor? And it passes. Okay. So now,
And you just have to, I guess I didn't do that either. Did I ask you if you accepted the nomination?
I don't remember. I accept the nomination. Dina, do you accept the nomination? Good.
Yay. Okay, good. All right, we're done with this. That's the bylaw.
So we've done the roll call.
I've done the roll call. We're good to go.
Okay. Is there any declarations of interest? You may declare them now or at the time. No declaration of interest. We have to have an adoption of the agenda. We haven't done that, have we?
Correct.
Anybody want to approve the agenda? Sorry, I can't see names. Helen, you're going to move it? Seconder? Dina is going to second it. All in favor? And it passed. And now we need to do the approval of the minutes for the Policy and Planning Committee Advisory Committee, February the 17th, 2022. That was a while ago. So someone who was at that meeting, can you, John? Well, and we've got it second. All in favor? And that passes. So our next item is Natural Systems Monitoring and Reporting Program Review Report. And I think we have Kelly and is going to present. Okay.
There we go. Afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name's Kelly Stiles. I'm the staff biologist at Mississippi Valley. As part of a major part of that role is that I help coordinate our monitoring program. And to be particular at this point, it is not the hydrometric modeling that is involved in floodplain. It's more the natural systems monitoring that is involved in surface water quality and biotic indicators. So I will just pull up that slideshow. Share screen. Right. And then let's just move this over here. So welcome. Why do we monitor? This is a big question, especially when we're out in all sorts of weather. It's not always just the nice days, but we monitor to assess the current health of our watershed. We monitor to identify trends and predictive analysis of change in our system. We use that knowledge to inform us about local field data and conditions when doing planning and permitting reviews. We inform other departments such as the engineering and decision makers. We share that data with residents, businesses, funders, academics, NGOs, the list goes on. Planning, design, and targeting of mitigation and adaptation strategies are key to some of the things that we do or that our partners do. And it's used to assess the efficacy of strategies over time. Program objectives, this is a very wordy slide. It's all in the handout that was given in your package, but really the objectives is to use a standardized protocol for monitoring so that we're not just consistent in-house year to year, but we're also consistent with other CA partners as well as other people who monitor. We want to deliver mandatory monitoring under the Conservation Authorities Act, namely the ones that we partner with the province, the Surface Water Quality Program and the Groundwater Program. We want to be able to review the monitoring requirements outlined in the Water Management Plan that was agreed to and enacted a number of years ago here. And we want to optimize the delivery of baseline water quality sampling, habitat and species monitoring programs to address the vast and diverse geography that we have. What do we monitor? We monitor at our program applicability is site specific. However, where possible, we monitor as many things as possible. So we layer as many protocols as we can at one site just to make for a much more robust data set. Surface water conditions are monitored in a number of ways, including chemistry, such as just basic grab samples that go off to a lab, biotic indicators, such as what lives there, the benthic invertebrates, the organisms, insects that come out of our water are good indicators of the status of that water. We also look at the fish communities there because what lives there, sensitive fish species can be a really good indicator of what's going on. There's also other tie-ins to regulations such as through MNR and DFO. In our lakes, we sample chemistry, but much more scaled down component than our stream system, where the main focus is total phosphorus, because that is the driving nutrient for things such as algae blooms. Biotic indicators is also scaled down, and we focus more on quality of life indicators for fish in lakes, such as the water temperature and amount of dissolved oxygen in the lake. And then we also look at water clarity, all standardized protocols. Lastly, our groundwater program is largely run and directed and overseen by the Ministry of the Environment. And through them, we sample chemistry, very similar set of parameters as the surface programs. And we also monitor water levels at 9 sites across the watershed. To give you an idea of the vastness of our programs, here's a map showing all of our sampling sites. Of course, we cannot get to every site in every year, depending on their program and protocol. Because of the size of our watershed and the diversity of the ecosystems, I've devised a rotational system where we go out sometimes once every 2 years to once every 5 years, depending on what the protocol is and how intensive that program is. And for a closer look in the City of Ottawa area, because there is a program called City Stream Watch that's very Ottawa specific right now, this is a closer view of the sub-watersheds that make up the Ottawa jurisdiction. And then how do we report? Spend all this lovely time out in the field gathering all this data, but that doesn't mean anything unless I can communicate it back out to yourselves and the public. So Conservation Ontario has a program called the Watershed Report Card. And it's gone out 3 times now, and we're currently working on our 4th. Goes out every 5 years on a standardized communication strategy, so that no matter what CA is reporting, it's all on the same scale. So an A grade here is the same as an A grade in Sarnia, and so on. So it focuses on surface water quality of very particular parameters of phosphorus, chlorides, benthics. There's also a groundwater component. And now that we're 10 years in to the sampling program there, it's been decided to be able to start reporting on that. Very specifically, the health concerns associated with nitrates and chlorides. And then aspects of our watershed characterization, such as the amount of forest and wetland coverage we have, are assessed during a GIS analysis. However, change in these 2 variables happens on a much different timescale than it does for surface water quality. And so reporting doesn't change quite as much during each of those 5-year windows. The next type of report I do on an annual basis is the integrated monitoring report. So after spending a season out sampling our lakes and the streams in that subwatershed, I then write a report to summarize it. The biggest users of those tend to be the lake associations themselves. They want to know what their lake's doing. They want to know what their neighboring lake's doing. And so that's why it's organized on a subwatershed basis. And lastly, City Stream Watch catchment reports. Just like this previous map, after I've spent a summer out in one of those watersheds, we summarize everything that we found there, and we send that back out. We post it online, we share it with our municipal partners, and also planning and regs uses it quite often when we have development near watercourses in that area. With anything, there comes challenges and opportunities. Watershed size and diversity is number 1. It's a big place we gotta look after. There's limited staff time, and the seasonality of fieldwork really puts this in a crunch. Right now, there's currently just myself as coordinator and 2 summer students. In the past, there have been different amounts of staff able to conduct multiple field teams, 1 crew in the east, 1 crew in the west, or whatnot, depending on what was going on that part of the season. There's also data management and use challenges, such as getting everything into a workable format in GIS and WSGI. And then from there, we typically right now only share with NGOs academics on a request basis and a responsive basis. However, in our opportunities, I put forth that reviewing the prioritization of our programs and site and reporting frequency can provide us some opportunities. Spanning in-house cross-training or potentially adding staff, that would be particularly helpful if we want to expand programs or deliverables. And then improving data sharing, both in-house and with external partners. Hopefully we can get to a point where we can reach out to academic groups and say, this is the data we have. These are the big picture questions we're asking. How can your analysis expertise help us out? So lastly, we recommend to yourselves that we organize our programs in the following way. Following the provincial's mandated definitions of category 1, 2, and 3. Category 1 programs are what we have the MOU with the province, the MACP programs, provincial water quality monitoring and provincial groundwater. Following that footstep is category 2. Those programs are used for informing planning and regulations reviews, as well as help inform municipal partners on watershed conditions. Things such as the city baseline water quality programs, stream and lake monitoring, and stream watch programs. Lastly, category 3 are much smaller scale, more opportunistic programs that we fit in amongst the others, such as stream and lake temperature monitoring, invasive species monitoring, algae monitoring, and seine netting. Any questions? And of course, for more information, there's a full report in your package.
Any questions? Yes.
There we go. It's a wonky button. Kelly, This is work that you're currently doing in 2023.
Yes.
When the category 2 and 3 situation comes in, how will this be affected?
Right now, everything is just being, some things in the previous definitions of categories 1, 2, and 3 were not fitting the definition of category 2 because we did not have MOUs with the municipalities to conduct them. The only program currently standing that we have an MOU is with the city of Ottawa for the city baseline surface water quality sampling program. Everything else does not have an MOU. So we are proposing that things such as the lake and stream biotic monitoring be bumped up to a category 2 and make an MOU with our partner municipalities to see those continue on in the future. So that's what the big change in the way the definitions are being applied and the way we're processing our program.
Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the package and the overview.
Yeah.
My take's going to be a little different.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a bit of a crosswalk between this agenda item and then when we talk about a land conservation strategy. And a different kind of monitoring, which is
Mhm.
natural heritage monitoring. We talk about monitoring wetlands, we talk about monitoring forests. And I appreciate why the focus is on water quality. But quite honestly, if we want to deal with issues like climate change, we're not going to do that by looking solely at water quality,
Mhm.
if at all.
Yeah.
So my question is, because one of the recommendations, increase emphasis on volunteer-based citizen science activities and programs.
Yep.
To heighten community interest and broaden the collection of baseline information. So that's very aspirational, but also pretty vague. And I've worked for the past several years on citizen science
Yep.
in the city of Ottawa. And there's one statement in the report, which quite honestly, I find a little over the top. And it deals with it. This is 6.5, where it talks about iNaturalist, eBirds, et
Mhm.
cetera. And in essence, quite honestly, and I'll just read it out for people.
Yeah.
Professional and amateur naturalists are encouraged to share their observations on websites such as iNaturalist, eBird, EdMaps. These data are generally ad hoc, variable in data quality, geographic, and temporal representation can show strong interest bias and are limited by the skills of the participants. For these reasons, they are not reliable sources of consistent data for localized analysis and decision-making. That is not a way to invite professional and amateur naturalists to partner and program with MVCA.
Yeah.
So I understand the technicalities of it. I know even the city of Ottawa has similar concerns, but quite honestly, there is value in
Definitely.
looking at what citizen science can offer, even in terms of natural heritage.
Oh, for sure.
So
There,
I
there's
think
more
there needs to
people
be-
on the landscape for
There,
sure.
there needs to be some way of saying, if we are going to talk about
Yeah.
future new directions, to try and give a better indication of that. Maybe that happens under the agenda item on the
Yeah.
conservation strategy. I don't know. But I'm saying that this one stands out
Mhm.
and it's not good marketing, to say
Yeah.
the least.
And it's just a caution that the data isn't potentially consistent, right? Or reliable for the long term, whereas in-house programs can be more managed and delivered consistently. But we are definitely all for partnering with citizen science and seeing where they can help us fill gaps. But we don't want to rely on that as our only source of data, I think is how, but communicating that and wordsmithing that, definitely appreciate your
Okay.
feedback.
Yeah, because there does need to be that bridging, because without that bridging, it's sort of a bit in your face.
And even particularly the program City Streamwatch relies on volunteers being part of the crew. So definitely there's work to do here on the wording of this program summary. And that's why we're bringing it to you for that feedback.
Thank you.
Glenn, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the presentation and the information. I highlighted the section about tracking of data requests and open data as potential opportunities. Can you give us an idea of what kind of stakeholders or organizations typically request data now and how you could see that expanding in the future?
Yeah, definitely. So people that typically request data right now are either an actual lake association who just wants to know the history of what we know about their lake because they're working on a lake plan, or maybe they're up for funding for some sort of invasive species response or something like that. We help them with data for that. Other requests, the Ottawa River Keeper, because our river and our jurisdiction is tributary to what they do. Most recently, they asked for water temperature data. So I have a fleet of temperature loggers I have out there, and then they had a fleet of temperature loggers they were putting out. So we communicated ahead of time to not overlap on sites. And then we shared at the end of the season. So I filled gaps for them, they filled gaps for me. That's one really good example. The other examples are much more academics. The neighboring universities in this area will sometimes send out a PhD or master's student or whatnot to study something. And so we say, here's Mississippi Lake, here's our data on it. Those kind of things tend to be our data requests. There is the occasional engineering kind of data request where a consulting firm is working on something. And then I'm able to say, I know what fish are in this stream, or I understand here's some water quality data upstream of the Carleton Place water intake. Those kinds of things are also data requests we receive.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, I think this is a really important area that we should pursue and continue to pursue. There was also a link, I guess, to the category 3, the monitoring that connects us to the community. And I'm drawing a link to, I think, the next item on our agenda around compliance, which recognizes education and engagement as an important foundation to encouraging compliance. So all of these things do work together to further the strategy and the priorities for the authority. So thanks for the presentation.
Yeah. Thank you all for your feedback. Any other questions?
John, you have another one?
Thank you. Just an additional comment based on what Glenn has said, and that is, again, if we look at the GIS data for wetlands and for forests, what is that interest? And
Yeah.
maybe some clarification as to where are we in terms of open data on our GIS data?
Sally?
Great, thank you. So we don't have any formal policy as yet on open data. It's not been a priority to date. What we have been doing is making sure our regs mapping and that our water level data and those very operational day-to-day kind of data and the like are available on our website and up to date. Open data generally is an area that we need to move in that direction. A lot of CAs have moved forward with that. A lot haven't as well. It's we're kind of laggards to the game on that. So it's an area we recognize we need to move forward on. And one of the things Kelly mentioned, however, is one of the challenges we have is getting information into the database into a format that we could easily upload and make available on the internet. So it's there's several steps involved at the operational level for us to be in a position to upload information onto our website.
I think you're right. That is the future. And certainly the interest is there, but it's good to be prepared for that interest as opposed to starting off and then figuring it out as you try and make it work. So there are some critical, even policy aspects.
Janet?
I had it. There we go. I wanted to make a comment on 6.6.2, and this is on the Ontario Power Generation. I'm actually involved in that BioBlitz, and it's a whole year BioBlitz. It's not a single point in time. In fact, Marissa was on the call that we had last week. And it's run really by OPG with the Ottawa Field Naturalist Club. And I know a lot of the people at the OFNC who are doing this BioBlitz, and they are experts in their field. So I also think that this paragraph needs to be corrected, because I think that the leader for it, who is going to write a report of this full year BioBlitz capturing all the species and multiple points in time, will actually be extremely useful to MVCA.
Do we have any other questions? Good. This is the pause.
Yeah.
So be resolved that the Policy and Planning Committee recommend that the board approve continuation of Mississippi Valley Conservation Authority's monitoring and reporting program with the recommended changes set out in this report and the attached program review document. Do I have someone who's going to put that on the table? Yes. Glenn? And do we have a seconder? Dina? All in favor? Okay, and that passes. Moving on to number 3, section 28 compliance strategy report. Okay, Matt, go ahead.
Thank you. Unfortunately, Alexis Perrin, our regulations officer, is ill today and wasn't able to join us, and was instrumental in putting together the strategy. So I'll just start off here. And I'm sure most people are familiar with this hierarchy of enforcement, which we practice here at the MVCA. As mentioned, we work together with municipalities, other enforcement agencies, and the public to make sure that our mandate is understood and the rules of engagement are understood. And as things accelerate, then obviously you have to get more involved from an enforcement perspective. But MVCA has a pretty solid history of being involved with landowners and doing presentations and getting information. And our website is certainly, after the floods of 2017, we put a lot of effort into FAQs and information on the website, and engaged with landowners so that they knew exactly what the requirements were for moving forward and what the rules are around rebuilding in sensitive areas. So we've had a compliance strategy, an informal strategy, which is basically the backbone of the principles of the one we're presenting today, for over 5 years. Andy Moore, our former regulations officer, was a member of the provincial regulations committee and was instrumental in moving that forward. Not every CA has a strategy. We've had a lot of progression, and also a lot of flooding, and a requirement to ensure there's a check and balance so that works are completed that are in conformity with floodproofing requirements, just so future landowners are protected. So that's kind of the crux of why we started. And the other objective is that staff need to understand when certain requirements must be adhered to, and the public also need to understand what requirements and what information we're going to require, so that we can basically sign off on their file. So all these other things that are mentioned, which are in the report, are extremely important, again, in the public engagement. Basically head off things before they become an issue. And as you saw with the hierarchy in the previous slide, we do not want to get to the top of that pyramid. We want to maintain a relationship with landowners and developers. So we have a table which is submitted in the report, which we have, again, this has been the backbone of our practice for a long time. And essentially, we've required compliance inspections for any redevelopment in the floodplain to ensure Those are very technical requirements that landowners must adhere to, and the development and consulting community understands that. You do not want to invest hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars into a structure that will simply not be flood-proof and sustain damage to another flood. So there's a check and balance, also cut and fill. That's the risk. That's basically public safety. We cannot create exasperate flooding somewhere else if someone doesn't follow the proper procedures in regard to placing fill or removing fill in regulated area in the floodplain. And again, wetlands, this is a case by case basis, but we also have to protect the integrity of the wetland and the function of the wetlands. So if they're within a certain distance of different types of wetlands, then that triggers an inspection of staff. So out of the three of those, the most complex are certainly the first one, having to look at lot and grading plans, which the landowner must submit. Fill placement is essentially a stamp by an engineer, and generally our engineering staff will review that and then update the mapping accordingly. And then we have major infrastructure projects where really the onus is on the municipality, and the municipalities are it's in their interest to make sure that those major infrastructure projects are done correctly, and we do check those on a case by case basis. And as you get further down the list, we look at we do have a lot of shoreline erosion permits for protecting waterfront, but what we are proposing is that there's kind of a self-check where they send in a picture, we look at the submitted drawings, and if we are unsure about how the works were completed, then we will do an inspection, but most of this is based on risk and safety. And the star that's missing there says all complaints are subject to an inspection. So if we do have a fairly rigorous reporting tool on the web, and whenever we receive a phone call. So if we do receive a complaint, 99% of the time it's inspected. We do have some individuals that maybe phone us too often. So we do look at those. So what does this mean in regard to workload and planning around resources? From 2019 to 2022, 90% of the permits are in compliance. Maybe that number seems low to some people, but some of those non-compliant issues are simply they don't have their sediment and erosion control fencing up adequately to meet standards. Other times they haven't submitted the final drawings and they are not in compliance, and those will cause definitely some challenges. So if you look at 2021, which was the pandemic year and the year that we had certainly an increase in permits, we had 60 rebuilds and 15 cut and fills and 56 wetland applications. So if we use the proposed matrix, and the matrix we've essentially been following, we would do 100 mandatory compliance inspections, which is about a third. And if we look at 2022 numbers, we had, again, numbers have leveled off to pre-pandemic levels. And I think they'll probably, if I was gambling, I would say they would stabilize around 200. And we had 35 rebuilds, 17 cut and fills, and 44 wetlands permits. And again, that would result in approximately a third of those being inspected and 75 compliance inspections. So this definitely gives staff targets to use for work planning. It gives the public an expectation of what is required and when they might inspect or when they might expect an inspection. So it sets out basically the requirements of the permitting and the compliance process. And again, it's something we've been using, but haven't really formalized. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Matt. Is there any questions?
If I may,
Yes, go ahead.
couple questions on the thing. I just see floodplain in red, consents or building in floodplains. basically, I'm thinking more on the consents. Is it possible to build a house or a structure in a floodplain?
A lot of things come into play there. Is it a two zone? So the floodplain is divided
So you're saying if you can room without a floodplain, you move to that area, right?
in Mississippi Lake and Constance Bay, we have what's called a two zone policy. So the flood fringe and the floodway. So if you have a vacant lot, you cannot build in the floodway, but you can in the flood fringe. And how they determine that line is based on depth of flooding and flow, basically risk. So, but if you have a lot in the floodway or floodplain that is vacant, it's sterilized. It's kind of follows the,
Okay, so I learned something already. I didn't know there was two kinds of floodways and floodplains. Appreciate that. Another question I got to do with planning, but not what was in your slide. I sound like a broken record, but the many adjustments in the city, Miss May always comes on our screen. And we always ask with every application, whether it's a variance or a consent, any comments from the Conservation Authority, and she says, well, there's a stream, blah, whatever there is, and it's very, very helpful. And that hasn't changed now in the 15 years I've been there, basically. But with the new regulations, we're thinking about maybe not having as much staff or whatever we're going to do, but nothing has changed so far. Is there going to be a change? Or are we going to keep going? Or do we know? I'd like to get an answer because I know the other members in the Committee of Adjustment have no idea either what's going on as far as that goes, but I would, now I know it goes to the City of Ottawa, planning staff and environmental staff, they're terrible. That's all I can say about it. Terrible getting back to you and getting things done. So do we see anything happening with this, or is it the same thing?
well, Bill 23 is pretty prescriptive about what the Conservation Authority can comment on. So we definitely natural hazards. There's no change there. Okay, so floodplains, stream alteration. So if you wanted to move a water course to accommodate a setback, we're still involved. However, we do not comment whether the setback is appropriate to protect that stream. So that's different. And then we still review and we still comment on wetlands, but only from a natural hazards perspective. So we don't comment on the impact of the adjacent lands from an ecological perspective, but it does affect water balance and it does affect flooding. So our comments are still required and they're
So it's
They're
basically
valid.
the same amount of work, because the comments you don't provide, you already know from figuring out the other comments, right? So you can just do the whole scope. So now we've got two departments to deal with.
I
Come
think
on, let
that's
it
the
go.
new reality.
So, okay, so I don't see the workload becoming any less for the Conservation Authority if we're still going to report on all those things.
There's some change in role, but and there's some things municipality definitely is responsible for. So again, the ecological component, setbacks, water quality, those things are definitely the municipality's responsibility. We have information. I was just on the call today with city staff about, as Kelly mentioned, we have information on all those streams about, so they can make decisions about what is the temperature of the water, what is an appropriate setback given the sensitivity of that water body. So the information's there. It's just how it's packaged from the authority. So we're working on that.
Thank you.
If I could just comment on the resourcing side of things. So the formal side of our work and commenting has changed. We don't write up comments on, as Matt said, the ecological values of wetlands. But it doesn't mean that municipalities aren't asking us questions, because in being them now the ones responsible, this is where we need to be providing our monitoring data and the like to them, because now they're in the position where they have to make the comment and that assessment. So it's the one thing I just wanted to clarify with you though, Steve, is are you experiencing situations where the CA hasn't been consulted on matters where you feel there is a water hazard or other natural hazard present? because one of the things we're concerned about is whether or not municipalities are continuing to circulate us. Like, we can only comment on matters where we're circulated, right? Mhm. Okay.
Quality and things, but I do notice a lot of adjournments. And that's not the problem. There's the job that's not getting done.
Yeah, we've tried to standardize our letters so you can understand exactly the scope of our review right at the beginning. So if it's not there, then it should be addressed in other areas.
Any other questions? Glenn, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt, for the presentation. I wanted to ask about communications, and if you can give us a kind of a standard practice. In the report, there's a pyramid of typical enforcement, and I think the top three approaches to enforcement, the top three most severe seem to include some kind of a public notification or closing the loop of when with the public as to when enforcement, sometimes court action, civil action, and so on is needed. How does Mississippi Valley currently approach public communications around enforcement activities?
That's a good question. Generally, when we're doing our investigation on a site, we don't engage the public or tell them many details besides the fact that we're in the process of an investigation. Simply, we don't want to jeopardize the process. If we often get freedom of information requests because these investigations extend for a long period of time and people want to know what the background is, and there's rules about releasing the type of information. If we're successful in and again, the last option is to go to court. But if we go to court and we are successful, we do generally release a media release about what happened with that file. Simply, it's because it's usually in the public eye. But we don't really have any type of engagement with the public besides that. People do call, and we are very guarded in what we say because we don't want to jeopardize anything. And we also have to respect the people that we're engaged with in trying to bring them into conformity. A lot of the time the landowners, they do, once they see the options and what's available, they do work with us. So we don't want to jeopardize that.
I think that's generally a good balance. I do know feedback I've had from residents in the rare case where there has been a court prosecution or a higher level of enforcement. The information releases that Mississippi Valley has provided have been really well received from the community. There's an ongoing narrative that some property owners get away with things, and perhaps they do, but I think the follow-up and the press releases and other communications are really helpful to counter that narrative and give the public some confidence that these things, there are consequences when people do break the law or don't uphold their responsibilities. My suggestion would be, I'm not sure if this report is going to the board or not, but my suggestion to staff would be consider adding a small section or paragraph that would outline and explain the general approach to public communications around enforcement. It's just one area I thought the report could have been stronger with. So thank you.
John, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Matt, do people use photographs when they're submitting a complaint, or do you even request photographs as part of your inspection process?
People do submit photographs. We also have an online reporting tool on our website, so they're welcome to. Whether we use them is that's a whole different issue. And we certainly take photographs whenever we go to site. That's like our number one tool is our camera. So they're important, but again, we have to be careful and we have to validate if someone does submit a photograph. We've actually had people submit pictures of the wrong property and it's been problematic. So we have to be very careful about what we receive. So it's the onus is on staff to get all the details and understand what's going on.
And just one quick additional question. Again, on the public communication side, if someone registers a complaint, do you then respond to the person who registered the complaint, how it's been addressed?
Again, it's we generally follow up and tell them that thank you, we received your information and we're investigating, but these things don't end quickly and they take a long time. So and the majority of the time we can resolve it, but it's not quick a lot of these times. And so they generally phone back, but staff don't go out of their way to say we've made some progress. But we do contact them initially. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glenn, your hand's still up. Do you have another question?
I do not. Thank you.
Any other questions? Then I'll read the motion. Not a motion, so we'll move ahead into area 4, conservation strategy, scope and methodology. Sally, you're going to do that?
Okay, thank you. So I'll just move this out of the way there. So carrying on. The conservation strategy is something that we've been talking about actually for several years since we started work on the Mississippi River Watershed Plan, which was ultimately approved in 2021. But we've been talking about the need for some sort of conservation strategy for the entirety of our jurisdiction, probably predating my arrival, but definitely throughout the development of the watershed plan. And so one of the key recommendations coming out of the Mississippi River Watershed Plan was that a land conservation plan be developed for not just the Mississippi River watershed, but the entirety of our jurisdiction. With the concept being that, you know, there are key areas within our jurisdiction that are valuable for any number of reasons and should be identified, and various means and tools looked at to how we can protect them going forward. And then on the heels of us doing that work, came out OREG 686 from the province that basically said we had to do a conservation area strategy. Now, while their focus, when you read the document, is largely on our conservation areas as per the title, it also looks at other acquisitions and disposals and how we manage conservation owned or controlled land. And so this is a document that we have to actually prepare and that has strong overlap with what we had conceived of doing under the watershed plan. And this one is due to be completed by the end of next year. And then most recently, Canada did sign on for a commitment under the UN Biodiversity Agreement to protect 30% by 2030 of key lands and waters. And when you go on the federal website, it speaks about an OECM approach, which is laborious to say, but other effective area-based conservation measures, which basically means what I'm showing you on this slide here, which is that everybody has a role to play and that it doesn't have to be in federal ownership to be protected for conservation purposes, that there's a role for organizations such as ourselves, the feds in the province, Indigenous communities, et cetera. And that the key is that whoever owns that land or manages that land makes the commitment and puts in place processes or measures to ensure the conservation or preservation of those values going forward. And so what this conservation strategy that we're going to be working on is looking to blend all of these objectives. First and foremost, it absolutely has to meet the requirements of our legislation and the regulation. So it will address specifically our conservation areas, our water control structures. And then, as you would have read in the report, we do have a handful, a smattering of other properties that were expropriated after floods, primarily on the Clyde and with provincial monies, when there were provincial monies for doing that. But the other piece of this is going to be looking again across jurisdictions and prioritizing areas for the work we do in stewardship, prioritizing areas for conservation and preservation, not just by us, but all of our partners. And I speak in, specifically of the land trusts. We have the Mississippi Madawaska Land Trust, who we partner with extensively, and as well as the province and others. And then also to look at areas that we need to be prioritizing because those lands and waters have an important role in our ability to adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change. So it's really going to take a comprehensive look across the jurisdictions, comprehensive, but at, I'd say, a 10 to 20,000, feet above, whatever the expression is, we have to keep it at a level that's appropriate to our jurisdiction level. We will try to get into specifics to a certain degree, but we have to be cognizant also on the resources and the sensitivities about being too particular and specific, especially when it comes to land and what it's used for and now and in future. Some of the key steps that we're going to take and where there'll be also consultation are documenting current state. So obviously doing a document specific to the properties we own, but also looking at across our jurisdiction at existing land use and hydrological areas for our key catchment areas. And you would have seen, I'll pull it up shortly, that drawing that shows areas over which we have some measure of control using existing structures, because part of adaptation and mitigation is maybe looking at how we're managing water and are there opportunities on a go-forward basis for us to alter our current approach and to make sure that certain lands are protected because, for example, wetlands provide a significant role in both flood mitigation and base flow provision during low flow conditions. And then what we're notionally calling core natural areas, and I'll speak to this when we get to that drawing. So then once we've sort of documented current state, looking at what the pressures are on those areas and where we may need to take action to protect lands or waters. And to that end, we're looking at trying to identify at a community-wide level what are the indicator species? What do we want? What do we want to be keeping? Like, what are we trying to protect here? And trying to identify across our jurisdiction, how many bears is enough, as it were, right? You know, there are key species that if we want to keep them in our jurisdiction, that they have also a land requirement associated with that. They have habitat requirements at different stages of life, at different times of year, et cetera. So pulling out some key indicator species that can help us engage in that conversation. And then once we have those kind of baseline conditions and needs assessments, then trying to come together and say, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? What are our goals and our objectives? And then how can we achieve that going forward, both at our local conservation authority and property level, as well as across the jurisdiction to support decisions by your municipalities, by other land trust organizations, the province, et cetera. So that's the overall kind of approach, and each of these stages would have consultation and engagement with them. So now I just wanted to show you some of our initial findings. So what this drawing here is showing you is land that has some sort of conservation designation on it. Either it's owned by a land trust or ourselves, the city of Ottawa or another municipality, or the Crown. So you can see that as you move from west to east, the number of properties declines precipitously. The other thing is, especially in the city of Ottawa area there north, in the north of the Queensway, those yellow properties just immediately north of the Queensway. One of them is the recent restoration area that we now have as a conservation area. To the north of that is a second line property. If you were to walk that site, you would see it's heavily degraded, though it's in a natural state. It's so overused by the public because it's one of the few natural areas that people have access to in that area, that it's seriously degraded. So it's a question of not just identifying what land is being conserved, but for what purpose, and how are those natural values, et cetera, being managed and protected for. So that's kind of a current state, and we're continuing to build this map. Alex is continuing to do research with other organizations to populate this. The next one shows you analysis that we did that was looking at what we're calling core natural areas. And to be defined as a core natural area, the forest on that property had to be of a certain age. And the age differed whether or not you were on shield or off shield. So roughly, I'll show you using the cursor here, roughly something like this is the boundary between off shield and on shield. The pressures on off shield are far, far greater. So our threshold for that, I think, was 100 hectares or acres. We remember our units? I'm gonna say it was, gosh, it's not bad. I think it was acres, but I'd have to check that. And similarly, and I think it was 100, 120 for on shield, and the similar threshold in terms of size for wetlands. So the concept here is that these are areas that still have an inner area that form habitat for species. That once a forest or a wetland is so broken up that it's fragmented, and there's a lot of external pressures, be it boating or people or roads, et cetera, whatever the case may be, it severely erodes the habitat quality for whatever species is using that. So these are what we would consider kind of those remnant areas where there is still a significant habitat role being played by these wetlands and forests. We've in in creating this first version of this, we've allowed for setbacks from utility corridors, et cetera. So these are really what you get when you are very strict in terms of the size of the parcel. And this is also relating to ownership because we are looking at contiguous parcels of land, meaning there's no break-in disconnect between the parcels. The green is what's owned and crown. So there is a conception, and I'm not saying it's wrong, that we don't have to worry about core natural areas because so much of it's crown land. But what this shows you is actually probably, and I haven't got the calculation, but maybe half is crown land. The balance actually is largely in private ownership. And I think that's the reason why the federal government has said we need to take this OECM approach, because there's no way anybody's going to buy up all these properties, and nobody wants to sell them necessarily, and the government can't afford to or want to manage them. So really what it comes down to is educating people and having them understand the value of those properties and what stewardship activities they can do, as well as at the municipal level. If there are particular policies municipalities want to introduce, or at the provincial level, then that's open to you, but at least you have the information you need to make those kind of decisions at a municipal planning level. So, and then this last one is, as I mentioned, these are MVCA owned or controlled drainage areas, in that we are operating those dams or weirs. And you can see how, I'll just use the cursor again here. This is the Clyde, and this is the Fall River. And then this is the main stem of the Mississippi. And so each of these dots represents a water control structure that we either own or operate on behalf of MNRF or OPG. And then we have this last dam here at Carleton Place. So this is the area of our jurisdiction that has control. Everything else downstream and everything that I'm outlining here with the cursor has uncontrolled flow, meaning all that water is running off of the land directly either into the Mississippi or the Carp. So, and yet these are the areas in many respects that are at risk, particularly under future development scenarios. So that's why it's critical that, we be engaging in these kind of conversations around what is the art of the possible as Carleton Place grows, as Almont grows, as Kanata, Stittsville grow. What are we doing to protect the upstream resources to make sure that whatever is being stored today is stored going forward? And that has implications, as I mentioned, on your protection of wetlands because of the critical role they have from a hydrological perspective in managing flows in these systems. So for instance, over here in Stittsville, we have the Goulburn wetland, which is immediately upstream. Just to put this in context, generally speaking, up until recently, we felt that it would never be developed because it's a designated PSW. But under the new provincial regulations, all bets are off because a developer in theory could go there, ask for a ministerial's order and develop that wetland. A wetland that is holding a boatload of water immediately upstream of a growing community. Similarly, outside of Carleton Place, similarly outside of Almont. So this is something that all of our jurisdictions need to be cognizant of, that with greatly expanded ministerial powers to override local planning rules, and with the impacts of climate change, this is a very real risk to existing communities as well as future developed communities. So this is why this is scoped into this analysis of this conservation strategy. It's not just about habitat for biodiversity. It's about we need to protect certain resources because of the hydrological role they play in mitigating natural risk within our jurisdiction. So I'll stop there.
Any questions for Sally? Janet?
There we go.
Do you
Well,
know
it takes
what?
about six-
Every time I put mine on
Yeah.
with the intent of bringing it to you, yours goes on.
Isn't that interesting? There you go. All right. So I guess I have two observations and a related one is, well, both related to concerns, and I'll start with a more specific one. When I do look at your core areas, I'm worried that your criteria for, call it the non-shield, might be too high. Like you might have set the bar too high. Because of course, the city of Ottawa has documented some of it, all of its core natural areas and its natural heritage system. And in my opinion, there are items missing on that chart. Thank you, Sally. Yeah, so I think you need to relook that. And, in particular, the Constance Creek corridor is considered extremely important by the city of Ottawa for its diversity. And yes, it's not owned by anybody or owned to be protected, but it's definitely has species at risk. And also the South March Highlands, I don't understand why it's not on here. And there are others, but those are two that I note. My second concern is broader, and that is, I find that the scope of this, although laudable, is extremely broad. And I don't know how, not only is it broad, I'm worried it's so broad that you'll end up not being able to execute anything because the outcomes will just be so, there'll just be so many of them, and they'll be possibly in specific. I mean, that's my worry. And I certainly appreciate what you're trying to do. I think it's wonderful, but given resource constraints, I'm wondering if you might want to consider narrowing this to some extent to what you were just saying, which is the wetlands and the control of water across the land. And I will say the biodiversity that's related to the wetlands, which again are all within sort of more of the mandate. And maybe that there are other mechanisms for trying to address things like the bear habitat, which I just don't even know how you would begin to deal with that. Like it's huge. It's something that a wildlife service should be dealing with rather than MVCA, in my opinion. So that's my concern. And I don't have an answer for you, but I think you might want to look at that.
Thank you, Janet. Is there any other? John, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I do like the framework. And as the title says, it is about collaboration. And maybe one of the ways to build on Janet's observation about it is rather immense. And that is also looking at a map of who are those partners and where do you have some potential for site-specific collaboration. And that those partnerships themselves and the combined interests involved might be a useful sieve in terms of then getting into that next level of detail and activity. So you talked about indicator species. Well, if you've got migratory birds, if you've got nature conservation, if you've got CPAWS, land trust, all those players already have some indication as to what their objectives, their approach, their mandates are. And it helps to really, I think, maybe uncomplicate the exercise as to really fundamentally saying MVCA will focus on this, but where we have opportunities to build a broader approach because of compatibility, then we're very interested. Because otherwise I could see people relying too much on MVCA to do too much of the background work and taking a wait and see approach. And that includes municipalities, including Ottawa as well. So I think I like the strategy. And the issue of connectivity also builds into those partnership arrangements, whereby, particularly where we do have that stronger watershed management role, of really being able to say, well, okay, are there partners there? And I had a question and I know we had a consultant who unfortunately passed away, who was doing a fair bit of the background work. How far did they get in terms of really being able to identify, I gather from an ecological perspective, what the priorities were? Could you give us some sense as to what the outcome is on that front? Thank you.
So it was Kathy's work that was used to do the core natural areas, but in terms of any sort of greater level analysis, we didn't get any further. So what you see is what Kathy was able to produce. She was the one that came up with those thresholds. And it was working with our GIS person that she, came up with that map that you see. As for your concern about scope, we've had lots of discussions about that for sure, Alice and I in particular. And so it's an interesting dilemma, I'll just say, because as we know, MNRF is no longer really present in the way it used to be historically. And while it is still engaged in certain areas, it's largely removed. It's night and day from when I was a young planner, right? It's just no comparison in terms of their presence, their capacity, and what they produce and have. So, this was an information gap that came up through the watershed plan and with the idea of doing a conservation strategy. Where within our jurisdiction should we be focusing efforts to, from the CA's perspective, primarily stewardship? Which areas can we engage with landowners on stewardship? But also, what properties should we be engaging with the province on in terms of enhanced land management on their crown lands? Because a lot of that crown land, of course, is also subject to the Mazenod-Lanark Forest Agreement, right? So are there areas within that managed forest that they should be looking at potentially removing because of the criticality of the habitat, et cetera? And so the objective has been, as scoped out here, to try to provide a framework that allows for those kind of conversations to take place. I agree with you that at a certain point, we're just going to have to draw a line and say, we can't go any further. Others do have data or they don't, and to identify those data gaps. But if the direction of the board is to keep it to, strictly to our properties, land owned and managed, and the hydrological value and natural hazard risks, to be managed through conservation tools, I totally understand and respect that.
Thank you. I don't think that's what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting managing the workload. I think the scope is one of those that if you've got the right partnerships, it might not prove to be overwhelming. The other interesting one, I don't know whether you've had the chance to look at it, and that is the biosphere model and just what they do from a governance point of view and the partnerships they build. So, in essence, it's very similar to what IUCN is providing, and it's all on that partnership model. Interestingly enough, it has a very large citizen science component. And the feature that I really like about it is that, again, it's opportunistic. So it's really saying, as the watershed plan, quite honestly, said, there are some things that are really worth doing, but you have to have some sort of priority setting mechanism. And maybe with that kind of built in, and I'm offering one example of priority setting, which is collaborative partnerships, there may be others. And it just helps to, I think, give people a sense that it's, not full of sound and fury signifying we don't know what. That's my overriding concern. Thank you.
So I think at the end of the day, as I envision this document shaping up, to the degree that the text deals with conservation authority land or infrastructure or mandate, we will have detail. To the extent that it deals with these more global objectives, it will have to necessarily be, 20,000 feet. We just won't have the capacity or the data, or that we'll have to map out where others can pick up where we've left off, right? That this is areas or, streams of science that need further examination. Who wants to lead that one and run? Because it's not our mandate, and I'd have to be coming back to all of your municipalities for a Category 3 agreement if you wanted me to do it, right? So, I mean, there's real practical limitations to what we can do, both from a resource side of things as well as a move forward perspective.
Yeah, and I think one thing that did raise my concern was because of what's happening on the Carp River Conservation Area, and the desire because of rescoped mandate that MVC has to step back a bit from that. And I know we need to have that discussion with Nick, but if you're having to step back from something that was originally going to be what's the word I'm looking for? A very high profile project or, conservation area, then what does that mean for other things? And I do, maybe it's just a lower priority, and I understand, and the mandates change, and I'm not, it's not a finger pointing thing. It's just a concern that if you have to step back from that, and be a lesser partner or less of a lead, I should say, not a lesser partner, but a partner who doesn't have the lead anymore, what does that mean for other things? And the only other comment I'll make, John, is I'm involved with a group that is looking at having Ottawa-Gatineau become one of Canada's first urban biosphere reserves. And yes, we're busy floating it through CPAWS and NCC and various other groups, which would have a huge impact on a whole lot of things in Ottawa. So, and Gatineau. So we could have a chat about that.
So the last thing I'll say about sort of scope is that because there is no plan at the scale we're dealing with for conservation, the province isn't doing it, right? And the national organization, Nature Canada, yeah, I mean, they're at a very high level. DUXA is very, mandate focused. There's nobody who on this sort of geographic level is doing this kind of thinking and work unless they're doing it at a municipal level, and the city of Ottawa resourced to do so, right? Just barely. So, right? And not enough. So the thinking in part is this is a service that the CA can provide to your local municipalities to do this high level assessment from a biodiversity, hydrological analysis to aid you in your land use planning, et cetera, and provide you with that information where if you want to take it to the next level, you can. It's to provide you with the framework that sort of helps point you in the direction and takes you that first step or two down the road.
Thank you. The other two stresses that you mentioned or triggers, I think is really important, and that is development pressure and climate change adaptation. And that again helps with the scoping as to where MVCA can in fact say, we've got a remit and it's very focused, and where we can find complementarity, we'll be there with you. But these are our building blocks. Thank you. Under other business, I really wanted to thank Janet again for a very delicious start to the meeting.
So our final resolution is resolved that the Policy and Planning Advisory Committee meeting be adjourned. Do I have a mover? Stephen? And a seconder? John? We don't vote on that, do we? No, okay, so, okay.